The safest investment is often the riskiest one. This sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. It's mathematics disguised as paradox. The biggest financial mistakes aren't made by gamblers and speculators. They're made by careful conservative people who think they're protecting themselves while actually destroying their financial future. I've watched intelligent people lose decades of purchasing power while congratulating themselves on being prudent. They avoid the obvious risks while embracing the hidden ones. They protect themselves from market volatility while exposing themselves to inflation devastation. The cruelest part, they feel virtuous about it. They think caution is wisdom, when it's often just fear dressed up as strategy. Risk isn't what most people think it is. The real risk isn't losing money temporarily. It's losing purchasing power permanently. It's not market crashes that last months. It's inflation erosion that lasts decades. It's not the dangers you can see coming. It's the ones that arrive so slowly you don't notice until it's too late. Let me tell you about Harold, a man who spent 30 years protecting himself into poverty. Harold was the kind of investor financial advisors love to hate. Cautious, conservative, obsessed with safety. He had watched his father lose money in the stock market during the 1970s and had sworn never to repeat that mistake. When Harold started investing seriously in 1995 at age 35, he had already developed a comprehensive philosophy about financial risk, avoided at all costs. Harold's investment strategy could be summarized in 3 words: safety, safety. He invested primarily in certificates of deposit, money market accounts, and government bonds. Nothing speculative, nothing volatile, nothing that could lose principal value in any given year. For the first 13 years of Harold's investing career, this strategy seemed vindicated by events. He watched the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 and felt smart for having avoided technology stocks. He watched the housing market collapse in 2008 and felt smart for having avoided real estate speculation. Harold's portfolio never declined in value during market crashes because Harold owned assets that couldn't decline in value significantly. His certificates of deposit were guaranteed by the government. His money market accounts were backed by stable institutions. His government bonds were secured by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury. Harold felt like the smartest investor he knew because he never lost money when everyone else was panicking. While his friends and colleagues saw their 401k accounts cut in half during the 2008 financial crisis, Harold's accounts remained stable and intact. But Harold had made a catastrophic error that wouldn't become apparent until much later. He had confused price stability with real security. Harold's safe investments were safe from market volatility, but exposed to inflation erosion. And inflation erosion over long periods is far more destructive than market volatility. Let me show you the mathematics of Harold's mistake. In 1995, Harold started investing $2,000 per month in various safe investments, averaging approximately 4% annual returns. Over 30 years, Harold contributed a total of $720,000 and accumulated approximately $1.2 million. That sounds successful. Harold more than doubled his contributions through consistent conservative investing. He never experienced the anxiety of watching his portfolio decline during market crashes. He slept well every night knowing his money was safe. But Harold's success was actually a devastating failure disguised as prudent management. If Harold had invested the same $2,000 monthly in a diversified stock portfolio averaging 10% annual returns, he would have accumulated approximately $4.7 million over the same 30-year period. Harold's conservative strategy had cost him $3.5 million in potential wealth. His obsession with safety had made him significantly less secure financially. But the real damage was even worse than these numbers suggest, because Harold's conservative returns barely kept pace with inflation over the 30-year period. In 1995, Harold's purchasing power was equivalent to someone with $720,000 in 2024 money. In 2024, Harold's accumulated wealth of $1.2 million had purchasing power roughly equivalent to $700,000 in 1995 money. Harold had spent 30 years investing diligently and had actually lost purchasing power. His safe investments had been systematically destroyed by inflation, so slowly that he never noticed the erosion happening. Meanwhile, someone who had invested in the risky stock market would have seen their purchasing power grow by approximately 300% over the same period, even after accounting for inflation. Harold's story illustrates the most dangerous misconception in personal finance, confusing short-term safety with long-term security. Harold's investments were safe in the sense that they never declined significantly in nominal value, but they were catastrophically unsafe in the sense that they failed to preserve purchasing power over time. This confusion between nominal safety and real safety destroys more wealth than market crashes, investment scams, and speculative bubbles combined. It affects millions of conservative investors who think they're being responsible while actually being reckless. The psychology behind this mistake is understandable. Market volatility is visible, immediate, and emotionally painful. When the stock market drops 30% in 6 months, investors feel the loss acutely and want to avoid similar experiences. Inflation erosion is invisible, gradual, and emotionally painless. When purchasing power declines 3% per year for 20 years, the cumulative effect is enormous, but the annual impact is too small to trigger emotional alarm. Human beings are wired to respond to immediate visible threats while ignoring distant, invisible ones. This psychological bias makes inflation erosion much more dangerous than market volatility for long-term investors. Harold's mistake was compounded by the financial advice he received throughout his investing career. His financial advisors were trained to focus on Harold's emotional comfort rather than his financial outcomes. When Harold expressed anxiety about market volatility, his advisors recommended safe investments that would help him sleep better at night. They prioritized Harold's short-term emotional state over his long-term financial security. This advice was professionally reasonable, but financially catastrophic. Harold did sleep better knowing his investments were safe, but he woke up 30 years later significantly poorer than he should have been. Harold's advisors had protected him from temporary market discomfort while exposing him to permanent purchasing power loss. They had optimized for the wrong variable entirely. The advisory industry has strong incentives to recommend conservative investments to risk-averse clients because these recommendations rarely generate complaints. Clients don't call their advisors to complain about inflation erosion, but they do call to complain about market losses. This creates a perverse incentive structure where advisors are rewarded for recommending investments that make clients feel safe rather than investments that make clients actually secure. Harold's story became more tragic as he approached retirement and began to understand the full scope of his mistake. At age 65, Harold calculated that his accumulated wealth of $1.2 million would generate approximately $48,000 in annual income, assuming a 4% withdrawal rate. This seemed reasonable until Harold calculated his actual expenses and realized that $48,000 wouldn't maintain his current standard of living. Harold's lifestyle required approximately $70,000 annually, meaning his conservative investment strategy had left him unable to retire comfortably. Harold was forced to work an additional 10 years to accumulate enough money to fund his retirement. But those additional 10 years of work were the result of 30 years of investment underperformance caused by his obsession with safety. If Harold had invested in a balanced stock portfolio, he would have accumulated enough wealth to retire comfortably at 65. His conservative strategy had cost him not just money but time, the most valuable asset of all. The real tragedy was that Harold's fear of losing money had caused him to lose far more money than any market crash would have cost him. Even if Harold had invested in stocks and experienced several significant market declines, his long-term returns would have been dramatically better than his safe strategy achieved. The 2008 financial crisis, which Harold had congratulated himself on avoiding, would have been a temporary setback in a stock portfolio, not a permanent disaster. Stock markets recovered from 2008 and went on to reach new highs. Harold's conservative investments never recovered their purchasing power. This illustrates a fundamental principle about risk and time. The longer your investment horizon, the less risky stocks become relative to safe investments. Over 1 year periods, stocks are much more volatile than bonds or cash. Over 30-year periods, stocks are much less risky than bonds or cash when risk is properly defined as failure to preserve purchasing power. Harold had optimized his portfolio for 1-year safety while exposing himself to 30-year insecurity. He had solved the wrong problem entirely. Harold's mistake reveals several crucial misconceptions about investment risk. First, volatility is not the same thing as risk. Volatility is temporary fluctuation in market prices. Risk is permanent loss of purchasing power. Harold avoided volatility but embraced risk. Stock prices fluctuate daily, creating emotional discomfort for investors. But stock ownership represents claims on businesses that generally grow their earnings over time. This growth protects against inflation erosion. Bonds and cash don't fluctuate much in price, creating emotional comfort for investors, but they represent fixed claims that don't grow with inflation. This stability exposes investors to purchasing power loss. Harold chose emotional comfort over financial security, mistaking the feeling of safety for actual safety. Second, inflation is a more dangerous enemy than market crashes. Market crashes are dramatic but temporary. Inflation erosion is gradual but permanent. The stock market has recovered from every crash in history, usually within a few years. Purchasing power loss to inflation is never recovered unless offset by investment growth. Harold protected himself from temporary market disruption while exposing himself to permanent inflation destruction. He had prioritized the lesser threat while ignoring the greater one. Third, time horizon determines appropriate risk strategy. Short-term money should be invested conservatively because there isn't time to recover from market volatility. Long-term money should be invested aggressively because there is time to benefit from growth and recover from setbacks. Harold had 30 years to invest, but used a strategy appropriate for 30 months. He had confused his investment timeline with his emotional timeline. Fourth, perceived safety often creates actual danger. The investments that feel safest are often the most dangerous for long-term wealth preservation. Cash feels safe because its nominal value never declines. But cash is guaranteed to lose purchasing power over time in any inflationary environment. Stocks feel dangerous because their prices fluctuate dramatically. But stock ownership is the most reliable way to preserve purchasing power over long periods. Harold had chosen guaranteed purchasing power loss over potential market volatility. He had selected certain failure to avoid uncertain success. Harold's story also illustrates how good intentions can produce terrible outcomes when based on flawed assumptions. Harold wasn't lazy or irresponsible. He invested consistently for 30 years, never missing a monthly contribution. He was disciplined in ways that most people are not. Harold wasn't greedy or reckless. He avoided speculation and focused on preservation rather than growth. He made conservative choices based on careful consideration of downside risks. But Harold's good intentions were undermined by his fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes financial risk over long time periods. Harold's discipline and consistency would have produced excellent results if applied to growth investments. His caution and conservatism could have been valuable traits if properly directed. Instead, Harold's virtues became vices because they were applied to the wrong strategy. His consistency ensured that he consistently chose poor investments. His caution guaranteed that he cautiously destroyed his purchasing power. This illustrates why character alone isn't sufficient for investment success. Character must be combined with correct understanding of risk, return, and time. Harold had the character necessary for wealth building, but lacked the knowledge necessary to direct that character effectively. The financial education Harold received had emphasized the wrong lessons. He had been taught that losing money was the primary risk to avoid, when failing to grow money was actually the greater danger. He had been taught that market volatility was dangerous, when inflation erosion was more destructive. He had been taught that conservative investments were safe when they were actually risky over long periods. Harold's story represents millions of investors who have been miseducated about the relationship between risk and safety in long-term investing. The conventional wisdom about investment risk, that stocks are risky and bonds are safe, is backwards for investors with long time horizons. For these investors, stocks are safe and bonds are risky. when risk is properly defined as failure to preserve purchasing power? This misconception exists because the financial industry, financial media, and financial education system all focus on short-term volatility rather than long-term purchasing power preservation. Financial advisors are trained to manage client emotions rather than optimize client outcomes. Financial media covers daily market movements rather than decades-long economic trends. Financial education emphasizes avoiding losses rather than achieving growth. This creates an environment where investors like Harold receive reinforcement for making decisions that feel safe but actually create danger. Harold's revelation came too late to fully recover from his mistake, but early enough to understand the magnitude of his error. When Harold finally calculated the true cost of his conservative strategy, he experienced what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling that results from holding contradictory beliefs. Harold had believed that he was being responsible and prudent. The mathematics proved that he had been irresponsible and reckless. These conflicting truths were difficult to reconcile. Harold's initial reaction was denial. He argued that his conservative strategy had protected him from major losses during market crashes. He emphasized the emotional benefits of sleeping well rather than worrying about market volatility. But the numbers were undeniable. Harold's strategy had cost him millions of dollars in potential wealth and forced him to work an additional decade before retirement. Harold eventually accepted that his understanding of risk had been fundamentally flawed. He realized that he had been optimizing for the wrong variable, emotional comfort, rather than financial security. This acceptance allowed Harold to adjust his strategy for his remaining working years. At age 65, Harold shifted his portfolio toward growth investments despite feeling uncomfortable with the increased volatility. Harold's late career strategy change helped him recover some of the ground he had lost, but couldn't compensate for 30 years of underperformance. The power of compound growth makes early mistakes particularly expensive. If Harold had started with a growth-oriented strategy and shifted to conservative investments later in his career, he would have achieved much better results. Instead, he did the opposite, maximizing the damage from his strategic error. Harold's story illustrates the importance of understanding risk appropriately for your specific situation and time horizon. Young investors should generally embrace market volatility because they have decades to benefit from growth and recover from setbacks. The biggest risk for young investors is not having enough money when they're old, not experiencing market volatility while they're young. Older investors should generally reduce market risk as they approach retirement because they have less time to recover from major losses. But even older investors need some growth exposure to protect against inflation erosion during retirement. Harold had used an old investor strategy during his young investor years, then tried to switch to a young investor strategy during his old investor years. He had perfectly reversed the appropriate risk strategy for each life stage. This timing mistake had compounded the damage from his fundamental misunderstanding of risk. Harold had maximized the cost of being wrong by being wrong at the worst possible times. Harold's story also reveals how social environment can reinforce poor financial decisions. Harold's friends and family consistently praised his conservative approach to investing. During market downturns, Harold received validation from people who admired his caution and stability. This social reinforcement made it harder for Harold to question his strategy, even when evidence suggested it wasn't working. Harold's social environment rewarded him for making decisions that were actually hurting his long-term financial security. Harold never encountered people who challenged his assumptions about risk and safety. His financial conversations were with other conservative investors who shared his misconceptions and reinforced his errors. This social echo chamber prevented Harold from learning about alternative perspectives on risk management until it was too late to fully recover from his mistakes. The broader lesson from Harold's story extends beyond investing to any situation where perceived safety creates actual danger. Many people choose career paths that feel safe but offer limited growth potential. They prioritize job security over skill development, steady paychecks over ownership opportunities, and emotional comfort over financial advancement. These choices feel prudent in the short term, but often prove costly in the long term when inflation, technological change, and economic evolution erode the value of safe career strategies. Similarly, many people choose educational paths that feel safe but don't prepare them for economic change. They study subjects that seem stable rather than subjects that offer growth potential, prioritizing certainty over opportunity. Harold's investment mistake reflects a broader tendency to optimize for short-term comfort rather than long-term security. This tendency affects financial decisions, career choices, and life planning across multiple domains. The solution isn't to embrace reckless risk-taking, but to understand risk more accurately and match risk strategy to time horizon appropriately. Harold's mistake wasn't taking too little risk, it was taking the wrong kinds of risk. He exposed himself to inflation risk while trying to avoid market risk, choosing the greater danger to avoid the lesser one. Proper risk management requires understanding all the ways you can fail, not just the obvious or emotionally compelling ones. Harold focused on the visible risk of market volatility while ignoring the invisible risk of purchasing power erosion. He protected himself from temporary discomfort while exposing himself to permanent disadvantage. Harold's story serves as a warning to anyone who confuses feeling safe with being safe, who mistakes short-term stability for long-term security, who optimizes for emotional comfort rather than financial outcomes. The safest investment strategy isn't the one that never declines in value, it's the one that preserves purchasing power over your investment timeline. For most long-term investors, this means embracing market volatility to avoid inflation erosion. It means accepting temporary discomfort to achieve permanent security. It means understanding that the biggest risk isn't losing money temporarily, it's failing to grow money sufficiently over time. Harold learned this lesson 30 years too late. His wealth, his retirement, and his peace of mind all suffered from his fundamental misunderstanding of investment risk. Harold's conservative strategy had been the least conservative option available. His attempt to play it safe had been the riskiest approach he could have chosen. The mathematics are merciless. Over long periods, inflation destroys conservative portfolios more reliably than market crashes destroy growth portfolios. Harold had spent 30 years protecting himself from the wrong enemy while surrendering to the real threat. The safety trap had claimed another victim. Harold's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous place to hide is in plain sight, behind investments that promise safety but deliver poverty, strategies that feel secure but create insecurity, decisions that seem prudent but prove reckless. True financial security requires courage disguised as caution, the willingness to accept temporary volatility to avoid permanent purchasing power loss. Harold chose temporary peace of mind over permanent financial peace. The market made him pay for that choice in the only currency it accepts, opportunity cost compounded over time. After 30 years, the bill was $3.5 million plus 10 years of lost retirement freedom. The safety trap had collected another fortune from another victim who thought he was too smart to fall for obvious risks. He was right about the obvious risks. He was wrong about the hidden ones. And in investing, being wrong about hidden risk is far more expensive than being wrong about obvious ones. Harold's safety was his danger. His caution was his recklessness. His prudence was his folly. The trap was perfect because it felt like protection.